When you subscribe to Disney Plus, don't know what to watch? Well, you're in luck. Catch this podcast and your watching dreams will come true. Hello, Internet, and welcome to the Disney Plus Academy podcast, the podcast where you learn and reminisce about all things Disney with me, your resident Disney Plus historian, Skylar Martin. Every week, I'll be slowly but surely going through the Disney Plus catalog, category by category. This week, I will be kicking off our coverage of Star Wars with Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Next week, we'll begin my Marvel coverage. The week after that, my Pixar coverage. After that, my Disney proper coverage, and then we'll repeat that cycle all over again. If that is confusing, I'll have a tweet laying out that schedule after this episode drops. But without further ado, let us begin this week's class with a retrospective discussion on Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. We will be doing this. Well, first, I already introduced myself, Skylar Martin, resident Disney Plus historian, but I want to introduce to you my guest. Guest, why don't you say something about yourself?
Hello, I'm Elfie. I am salty, especially about everything, but I'm also here to have a good time.
This is very true. So, this morning, Elfie and I watched Star Wars The Phantom Menace. It was a good time. It was, good, interesting time. But before we move into that proper, since this is the first episode, and the listeners are getting introduced to my Star Wars opinions, as well as yours, I thought I'd ask you a couple questions. I didn't prep this beforehand, so the answers are going to be authentic, folks. First, the classic. What is your favorite Star Wars movie?
Frick. I'm gonna have to go on a whim and say that Rogue One is my favorite Star Wars movie. I know going into this movie, I'm like, everyone's gonna die. Everyone's gone. No one in this movie's gonna live unless they're like important to the rest of them.
Very true.
Yeah, and then they still got me to kind of care about these characters, even though they're all gonna die.
Spoiler alert, by the way. That's fine. You're good.
It's like 5 years old.
Yeah,
they had their chance.
2016. I'm sorry. It was a bad year, but you should have seen that movie.
What about you? What is your favorite Star Wars movie?
So, for a long time, it was The Empire Strikes Back. That's kind of like the normal answer.
The vanilla answer, yeah.
Yeah. But recently, I've been going through some of the films more recently, and I have to say Return of the Jedi. Probably, it's kind of considered less serious, probably considered by a lot of people the worst of the original trilogy, actually, but just how much fun you have in the movie, just like right from the start, the rescue of Han Solo, and then the emotional climax, and the actual climax of the movie with like Vader and Luke fighting, and the Emperor, and just Vader turning like back to the light. A lot of really good stuff. So even though it's probably not the objectively well-made movie, it's probably Empire, but still.
I think that's the one of the original trilogy that I watched the most as a kid. Just because it's so lighthearted, and like I as an 8-year-old could understand it more thoroughly than the more serious Empire Strikes Back.
Yeah. Exactly. So second question, who is your favorite Star Wars character? If you had to you can just ballpark it if you can't nail down a real one.
I like Old Man Luke. I consider Old Man Luke separate from Luke we know from the original trilogy proper, just because he is like kind of a different character, because he's 30 years older than the original Luke, and so he's got a bit more life experience and he can be a bit more salty.
Fair enough.
And I hate, like, this is my one complaint, we're not at that movie yet, but my one complaint is the fact that we don't get to see more of like the classic Luke that shines through in a lot of the deleted scenes, and that's my only like real complaint about Luke's character in the new movies until we get to that point. That's where I'm going to leave my opinion at.
Well, you just made half the internet love you and half of it hate you.
Good.
So we're off to a great start. We'll get to that movie. Great. My favorite Star Wars character right now, probably Kylo Ren. He's a very conflicted character. Sometimes you don't quite know what he's going to do. He had a cool look going into The Force Awakens, and still, like, even without the helmet, and even with the helmet, Adam Driver is able to give like a really compelling performance. I'm excited to see where he goes in Rise of Skywalker. Last question. If you could have a lightsaber, what color would it be?
Green.
Green?
Yeah, because everyone's got blue. Everyone's favorite color is blue. Everyone I know's favorite color is blue. And I'm like, green's kind of cool. Green's a neat color. It's not seen as often. It's still pretty common, but it's not quite as often. And I just kind of like the color green swinging around.
Yes, I would have to agree with that. My color would also be green. Okay, so we took a little bit longer than we needed, but good to establish a baseline for our opinions. So going into the Phantom Menace, I will say first of all, I did not see the Phantom Menace growing up. It was not like a huge part of my childhood. I was introduced, my dad, who introduced me to the Star Wars movies, was an OT purist and original trilogy purist. And when we were in a Best Buy once, and I saw like the Phantom Menace on DVD, and I was like, "Whoa, there's more Star Wars!" And he's like, "Yeah, but they're not as good." But I was still really excited for more Star Wars, so he bought them for me, and I watched them. And as a kid, I loved them. And then kind of growing up as a teenager into like the YouTube, like red letter media, internet kind of culture, I was like, no, these suck. And I've kind of gone to a place where like the Phantom Menace is probably my least favorite Star Wars movie, but I don't hate it. I don't really. I mean, I get intellectually why people hate it, but I just don't have that type of energy towards this movie. It's an interesting start to the prequel trilogy, but I think I speak for a lot of fans, though this certainly isn't the only experience, that the prequel trilogy gets better as the movies progress. What about your thoughts on that?
My first Star Wars movie was Episode 3, so I didn't even know that there was any things that existed. They called it Star Wars Episode 3, I think, in the trailers, and I was just like, no, this is the first one. I was that dumb. But like, yeah, and I didn't know that Phantom Menace existed until like we were looking for beds at a store, and they had like the little TV up, and like they were playing the like pod racing scene like on loop. And I was like, what kind of fucking movie? Oh, I swear. What kind of movie is this?
It's fine. We'll put the explicit tag up. Okay. You're fine.
Cool. I can say that. But like, yeah, I was like, what kind of movie is this? And then my dad's like, that's one of the Star Wars movies. Remember when we watched Revenge of the Sith? And I was like, there's more? You told me that was just it, but that was just that one. He's like, no, that's the last one they're ever gonna make ever. But yeah, it is not the best one out of all of them. I'm not sure if it's my least favorite quite yet. It's honestly tied with Solo, but we'll get to that one if we get to that one.
Yeah. Eventually, we're on a bit of a time crunch, so we might just skip the 2 standalones. But who knows? Who knows?
Who needs sleep?
Who needs sleep? You're right. For the fans of this podcast, if there are any, please let us know what you think. But yeah, I can definitely see the problem. I guess we'll like start going into the movie proper, is that from the get-go, the opening crawl, probably out of all the movies, even as a kid, I was kind of like, I really didn't understand what was going on with like trade routes and the disputing and the Congress. And
prequel trilogy is very political.
Yes.
Which you don't quite like. It's when you're a child trying to watch these movies, you don't quite know how to grasp.
Definitely.
Because you don't understand politics, because politics are kind of a whole thing.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, it's definitely, The Phantom Menace is probably a movie that to me is more interesting to me intellectually more than anything else. I'm not really emotionally invested except for a few key scenes which like blow it out of the fucking park, but like for the most part, it seems I've heard this analogy before where it's like Episode 1 is like if someone was to build a sculpture of whatever, of like a person holding a sword, but of this sculpture it's very rough. You can't see the face. You don't know how the person is like gripping the sword. You can't see what type of sword it is. You don't know if the person is bald or not or has hair. So it's very like you can see like the general overall picture, but in specifics it gets a little there isn't much depth, at least to me, where I find it. Of course, the expanded materials, both, much more in the old Legends universe, but also in like current canon, kind of expand upon the state of the galaxy a lot more. But just the idea, like intellectually, what interests me about this movie is the idea that there is this huge, the biggest democracy ever, one that, a republic that
spans literal galaxies.
Exactly. So that was interesting to me, and this idea that this republic is so complacent and at peace that just this one, trade federation, this one, small little like conglomerate, this like species-wide thing is able to take control of a planet. That planet doesn't have any defenses. They're outmatched by droids that are pretty easily taken down. The Republic is like at a loss with how to deal with this because they're just used to they're just used to like peace in our time, basically. And that's what interests me the most probably about this movie, except it's very surface level. You don't really get a lot of discussion about that until you get to Coruscant, and even then it's like like
even then we're already halfway through the movie, so we kind of gotta get through that whole thing. The whole pod racing thing took up like a whole half of that first half. Whole quarter of that movie.
Moving on to things I like about this movie, though, because there are things I like, and going in chronological order, the effects still hold up to me.
Yeah, we were actually talking about that when we were watching the movie. Like, they are showing their age a little bit, and they, I think we both agreed they're probably touched up on, like, as they re-release them, because it's what George Lucas and company do.
Definitely.
But like,
that's a meme.
Like, for a film that came out almost 20 years ago, the like special effects are starting to show their age quite a bit, but like it's still like it's not it doesn't distract too much.
Exactly.
It's still good, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, and I think it all shows like how you use it, because there's a lot of practical effects in the prequels as well. People tend to forget.
George Lucas tried to advertise the prequel trilogy as like oh man, this is all special effects. This is using the best technology ever. But like a lot of those things are actually just practical effects. It's just he was hyping them up to be special effects.
Yeah, like the Trade Federation ship, for example. That's there are shots of it that are CG, of course, but there are shots of that are models as well. As I said, I think it mostly holds up to this day. The fact that I can look at the Phantom Menace and think that it's still holds up and is prettier than, say, Justice League. I know that's kind of like the example that everybody likes to crap on, but it's still
I do too.
So true.
And like there are times when like the Jar Jar doesn't look quite as pretty to look at. Like we mentioned on Tatooine, when he gets there, like he looks fine when he's on Naboo, his like home planet, where they probably modeled him and like did all of the aliasing and everything better, more efficiently for a greener, bluer world. Then we go to a yellow dirt world, and his model doesn't quite hold up as well because of that.
Right.
But this is early 2000s or late 90s, early 2000s movie editing and modeling.
So we get into the Trade Federation's ship, and one of the problems, at least for me, like looking back at this movie, that shows perhaps it hasn't aged the best, is that the accents of a lot of the aliens that speak English.
Oh my god.
At best, you can say are broken English. At worst, you can say is actively stereotypical or racist against like a particular group that is said to like only speak in this way. I know that they are compared mostly to like Japanese businessmen and kind of things, and that's where a lot of their accent comes from. But there are also times where like I'm not sure like what was going on. Like the actors sometimes slipped into like what sounded like a completely different accent, and it was just like jarring in a completely different way that was still probably equally as racist, but also like just like sort of like what. Like I think there was one point where he spoke and he sounded like he had more of a Spanish accent than a Japanese accent, and I was like, what's happening? And there's another time when one of the same species like spoke and they had like a French accent, and I'm like, okay, but yeah, like the accents are a thing they relied real heavily on for specifically those characters, and it was like really really jarring as a retrospect looking at it from a 20 years difference in societal standards and views on things. Yeah, definitely. I think. This is jumping ahead a lot, but I think in the Clone Wars series, if I remember correctly, the CGI one, most of the Nemoidians, like Newt Gunray and like even the returning ones, don't have that affectation, or it might be like super toned down. Because I know even in like Revenge of the Sith, that actor kind of tones down that very like sharp accent. It's still kind of in that nature, but it's not as like clearly in that type of
Who's the actor
vein.
that played him?
I do not know. But yeah, just and then just to quickly go over the other ones, the Gungans, even I don't believe that's like after a specific accent, but it does kind of speak of that trope of like the native with broken English.
Yeah.
And it doesn't help. Like it's better with some of the other Gungans that have like a deeper voice, but with Jar Jar and his
the
high-pitched voice, it comes off as like extra annoying, and while playing to that stereotype that like he's a very stupid person, and like let's be clear, like Jar Jar as a character is not the most intelligent person with or without the accent.
I do
but
think that,
it doesn't help him.
One complaint that everyone has about this movie specifically, that I will give them all points for, is the fact that Jar Jar is probably the worst of the joke characters that I can remember. At least he's never not being a joke.
Yeah.
Like the other joke characters, like even the Ewoks and like the Korgs, who are still kind of joke characters, and like the issue isn't the fact that they don't speak and Jar Jar speaks all the time. It's just the fact that like the Ewoks do have those moments, like when they're fighting the Imperial troopers, where they're like doing something, and it's just like, okay, yeah, like they're cute and goofy and whatever, but like they're still fighting and like they're doing things like seriously. Or even like the Korgs are just, they're there and they're still a joke character, but like they're only there for like a few seconds at a time, so they're not like over the top. Where Jar Jar has both, like Jar Jar is there all the time, and he's every time he's on screen, he's being a complete, like making complete fool of himself. Even during the battle with the droids, like he is the only like Gungan who is like not doing anything right, and anytime he does anything right, it's like completely by accident, and it still seems like he doesn't quite know what he's doing. I think the issue with Jar Jar is more the fact that they just overplayed his jokiness of it, and they didn't give him a chance. Like he doesn't need to do anything super cool or badass or anything to like redeem him. It's just the fact that he just never has like a pause between his jokiness.
Right.
It's like it's just constant joke every time you see him, and that's what I think is like the real reason why he's so annoying and people hate him so much.
And just to make it clear, the abuse and like fandom backlash towards Ahmed Best is he recently came out, I believe it was like a little over a year ago, basically publicly saying that he was almost driven to like the point of suicide by those words sting, and that sucks. So like I think I can speak for both of us when I just say like we're critiquing the character, how Ahmed Best plays him, how he moves, is very authentic. I can believe
I can believe that he's just a random goofy like alien. But yeah, it's just the way the character was written and directed. Like George Lucas is a visionary man who we all respect and or respected for a time, depending on your views on things. But yeah, like sometimes his character writing wasn't the most tip top.
Right. I think George Lucas has great ideas, but in some ways they're very simplified.
If there's not a wall for him to bounce it off of and like kind of refine, it can get lost in translation, which is like the case with literally every single writer ever. That's why you need an editor for things.
Yeah. going back to like the larger picture of things, George Lucas pitches Star Wars as this like modern mythology. Mythology, if you look back in times, is at times very simple. Once you like ignore the lore of everything, the reason that things happen, fables, like the messages you get out of them, it's not like Greeks had their mythology as like this big like expanded universe thing with like all of the complexities of politics. George writes this story, this Phantom Menace of this mythological story of here's how a great system can be eaten out with evil from within, and it might not be the best written in our opinions, for example, but it does the job. But I think the problem is that when you take that idea into characters, they can become somewhat less interesting. And as is the case with Jar Jar, I do think it's important that you have comedic relief in your film. Because, if you take this story very straight, it's pretty dark.
Honestly, if you take out a lot of, I think every single Jar Jar scene, this movie becomes like 200 times more serious. And it's not just because the jokiness of Jar Jar like takes down the thing. It's just the fact that like a lot of the movie is played kind of somber and very straight for most of it. Like there's a lot of interactions between a lot of the characters where they just seem kind of like melancholic about everything. And it's just like, And it makes sense for the Jedis, because the Jedis are especially played up in this movie, I think more specifically, to be like these unfeeling, objective people. Which may or may not have led to their downfall on things, but we'll get into that later. Maybe.
Yeah. I'd say last word on Jar Jar for now, that for me at least, the best of his comedy comes from situational comedy. So you mentioned
I agree. Visual humor is so good in general, but Jar Jar's is like whenever it's visual humor, instead of him just saying things that I don't even understand half the time because I don't know what he's saying.
So yeah, I would say his situational humor is the best. Particularly, I know you mentioned this kind of as like a, maybe not a negative, but in the battle at the end, which we'll go into depth more later, but that definitely is probably the highlight for me, where he's just taking out droids and stuff on accident, and he's not meaning to do any of it because he's just like this bumbling regular guy in this like high stakes mythological like top tier conflict.
There were times where I was just like, okay, yeah, this makes sense, but there are also like times, like I think half of that fight Jar Jar was doing something and I was just like, why? Like fair enough. Why are you doing it? But there were like a few times like the end where he like opens up the like the gate thing and the big electric balls or whatever roll out and hit the tank or whatever.
Mhm.
Like I was like, okay, yeah, I'll allow that. Like that's fine.
Yeah.
That's good. And then like immediately after that, he's like on the tank, and the other like Gungan is just like Jar Jar jump, and then like Jar Jar's just screaming and hanging on there, and then they both get captured, and I'm like, boy,
You hate to see it.
you hate to see it.
Um,
You hate to see it.
Yeah. So one of the more interesting sequences is right at the beginning of the movie with that Trade Federation sequence with them like getting on there and then having to get off, because it kind of speaks to the, I don't know, if this is intentional, I'd say would speak to the kind of arrogance of the Jedi at this point in time, that they have.
They're just like,
just
oh yeah,
two
we'll just
of
go
them.
and do these negotiations. They just do whatever. Like they're also sort of diplomatic beings and sort of a flex on the Trade Federation. Like they send these two guys who have laser swords and magic force abilities to like negotiate, and like
negotiations
one
will
of
be
them,
short.
yeah. And then one of the alien dudes is just like oh no, they got a Jedi here, I'm not negotiating with them, like they're using this to like basically threaten us basically, and that's pretty much what the Senate is probably doing more often than not, whether the Jedi wanted to admit it or not.
Yeah, there's probably definitely that aspect. And it's even said, in the beginning that the Chancellor is secretly dispatching them, which makes it seem like this isn't something the Senate knows about, which is interesting to me.
Oh,
but
I didn't even think about that, yeah.
Yeah, just, again, like, intrigue about the political situation right there. And I think what is interesting, as you said, is how their presence kind of completely, when they contact the Sith Lord, who we know as the Sith Lord, Papa Palpatine, who says, we need to accelerate our plans, we need to get, things going much more quicker because they're there. And again, it's just that kind of arrogance, or maybe not active arrogance, but just like presumption of,
we got this handled.
Exactly.
We got this. We're Jedi. We can read the future, but only when we want to.
Yeah, and they cut through the droids like butter, most of them, until the droidicas come along, which this is just a good time to say the visual like design of like the aliens and the droids and the new locations in pretty much every Star Wars movie, but I'd also say in this one, like for the new locations,
more specifically, they used a lot more of the different varying alien designs, and God knows how much it costs to make those costumes and practical effects, and the CGI
more than I'll ever make.
But like, yeah, I do think that's a disappointment I have in the new trilogy, is they don't do a lot of the alien designs too much. They did in The Last Jedi with the casino scene, but that was just sort of like, unless you're freeze framing like every single second of that, like they don't really matter that much, except for the like 2 or 3 that like are given close-ups. But I do wish that they did that a little bit more, even though it may not be the most financially viable thing. But hey, one can dream.
Certainly, we can all dream. Then they go down onto the planet, and again, this is another section that I kind of mentioned before that speaks to me intellectually, where the planet is being invaded, and even before that, the queen of Naboo, who's an elected queen, which still doesn't make sense to me, but whatever, we'll bypass that. 14-year-old elected queen, fine, yes, but she calls the Trade Federation up, presuming basically that like, oh, the Jedi are here, everything's fine, you're being commanded to reach a settlement, and you will do it, because there's no even inkling that the Federation or that anybody would like push back against the Republic. And when someone actually does on a large scale, and even this isn't that large a scale, it's like one planet that's like an important planet.
That's like if I were to take over like a small town.
Yeah, it's
if I were to take over like, geez, what's a small town? That one small town.
Yes,
it's got like 200 people in it. It's basically on that sort of metaphorical scale.
Yeah. Now, to be fair, the Naboo is like in the mid, or like it's either in the inner or mid rim, so it's like it's an important planet, but it's still like one planet. She calls the Trade Federation up, and it's basically, as I said, presumed that they'll be commanded to reach a settlement, as she says that everything will be worked out.
Kind of her trying to flex on them too. Like she calls up and she's like, "So how's the negotiations going?"
Yeah.
I bet it's going in my favor, huh? And they're like, "We don't know what you're talking about." Like completely lying to her, like, "We don't know what you're talking about." And she's like, "Oh."
Yeah.
And that's the end of the call.
Exactly. And I find it just, and this is again so weird, and again what speaks to me intellectually and like in terms of world building, that there's no planetary defenses for this.
Yeah,
Basically, like they have guards.
The only military they kind of have is the Gungans, who are like a warrior race.
Yeah, but they're not in league with the Naboo, so they're not helping them at this point.
And they don't really use very much advanced. Like they have shields in the final fight, like both like laser shields and like a force field shield that the droids just kind of walk through because they're not organic or whatever, I'm assuming. But like they just like they're the only ones that really have a sort of advanced technology in terms of offense and defense. But and they're considered the weaker, less intellectual of the two races, at least by the Naboo people.
Yeah, there's some interesting themes going on there. So yeah, the droids come down to the planet. Very, very cool scene with just this kind of like invasion, which we've never really seen in a Star Wars movie. Like obviously, like in Endor, you see the planet being overrun by the Empire and like, the Imperials,
but
this
see
isn't
the
like
act of them actually invading it.
Exactly.
It's
so
sort
I
of
think
an after the fact sort of thought.
Yeah, that's a cool.
I do like a weird thing that like I noticed every single time any ship landed on that planet was they just kind of phased into the trees.
Yeah.
Because of early 2000s editing and compositing and like all of that, whatever, all the other complications that we didn't quite iron out up until this point. But the like ships would just land and they just sort of phased into the trees like Homer phased into the bushes. That meme.
True.
And that was just something that I just thought, like, it didn't take me out of it, but I just thought it was funny. It was just sort of like, oh, look at that.
Yeah, it's definitely. I mean, as I said, it's still.
Yeah, it's
compared
very much
to the
a product
era,
of its
but
time.
yeah, it's still for this type of movie. It's still one of the best around. I mean, it's ILM, it's Lucasfilm, but yes, very much lull, much trees. So you get down to the planet, and we're introduced to Jar Jar amid running CGI animals, but we're introduced to Jar Jar. We've kind of already said most of our stuff, I think, on him. Just yeah,
he's done. He'll show up 2 more times.
Yes.
For like 5 seconds.
Yes.
Maybe we'll talk about it then. But until then, we're done. He's done.
Yeah, I do think one thing I'll touch upon, skipping ahead a bit to when we're introduced to the Gungan species and how, the
I get Zelda Ocarina of Time feels from seeing the Lord of the Gungan master guy, chief guy.
Definitely.
He's just a big fat fish man who rules over these tiny little skinny people.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, this is Ocarina of Time.
Yes. So we go down to the Gungan city, which is like, to me, a brilliant design of like a bubble city. It's a very unique design in Star Wars that we've really never seen anywhere else. And they talk to like the leader person, and he talks about, the Naboo don't like us. They think they're better than us. And that brings up some interesting, and again, like looking back at this from 2019, like some really interesting like colonial themes that aren't really touched upon at all. And
I think part of that is one, because George Lucas isn't that kind of writer.
Yeah.
And also just the fact that they only have 2 hours to finish
fair
this whole
enough.
movie. So they don't have the whole time to really tackle that thing, because that's not the central theme of this movie or this trilogy or this series really at all.
There's it kind of ties in later, similar to like a theme of Return of the Jedi, but I'll get to that. But it is interesting to me that that isn't really talked about, and you can't really know who came first. Maybe there were just always humans and Gungans on this planet. I know in the old Legends continuity, they kind of explained a little bit more about where humans were generally known as just a species that was insanely migratory. So Gungans were the indigenous race. But again, that's most of it is thrown off.
They just somehow evolved from the same thing, and all the Naboo people have webbed feet or something. And that would expand to Luke and Leia too. And that's my headcanon.
Like that headcanon. It's adopted. I'm the Disney Plus historian. I have spoken. But
I'm just saying, you never see Padme without any shoes on. I think you do, but I don't know. I don't look at feet, so.
Anyway,
until we get to that point.
Yes, theory
Leave
crafting on the Disney Plus podcast. Tell us what you think.
Hit me up on Twitter. Tell me your Padme foot thoughts.
Oh yikes!
Please don't.
please don't. We get a whole extended chase thing through the planet core, which is a dumb idea, but we're moving on. It's interesting visually, mostly just kind of like a mini action set piece. It's basically explaining, we need to get from A to B, but we need for it to take a little bit of time, which, whatever, makes sense. What I kind of like, this is really It's a meme now. There's a whole like a bigger fish thing is kind of in a way that's kind of about like what the Sith are all about, because you have the apprentice.
Ooh.
And at the end, foreshadowing of the fact that they know Darth Maul, or at least Yoda and Mace Windu highly suspect that was the apprentice. So yeah, then a bunch of stuff happens like aboard the Trade Federation ship, and the Naboo get captured. Again, ridiculously easy that there's basically like no defenses. They basically all surrender, which is fine. That's their culture.
I mean, you saw the city. All of their defenses went straight into architecture.
True. It's Space Italy.
Yeah.
We discussed this. Speaking of which, the design for like a city that looks like kind of like that classical, like again like Italian, like Roman architecture, but also like advancing it.
It's very round.
Yes.
Very round.
lot of round shapes.
Which is also what Italy just like in general, but it's like, I don't know, it's a different
Another
kind
edition.
It's sort of Italy mixed with Atlantis, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I can see that. The royal costumes especially are highly stylized. They're a little bit toned down in future films where we see the Naboo queens, but
I like how when they capture it, they gave her time to change into her morning gown, though. She's wearing her like regular queen gown, and they're like, the city's been overtaken, and like the very next scene you see of her, she's wearing her all black, and she's got that headpiece on, her makeup's different.
Well, that's the decoy.
Well, I know that's a decoy, but I'm just saying, like, I like how like when the droids and like the Trade Federation took over, they're like, she's like, hey, can I change my costume real quick? I have to mourn for my people, and they're like, okay.
Yeah.
As they're like invading her
they're like,
planet.
Fair enough. Proceed.
I do not understand clothes, but okay.
Yes. Canon. All canon right here, folks. So that's Jedi, after almost being killed by like 3 separate fish. Finally.
God.
Yeah.
There's always a bigger fish.
That would have been an end to the movie. But they come and then again dispatch the droids with ease, because laser swords cut through droids like butter. And then, fun action sequence with the droids. And again, going back to the whole world building thing, how one of the head guard sees a hangar full of droids that is like probably definitely less than 30 of them.
There was like 15 maybe.
Yeah.
And he's like, there's too many of them. And
I'm like, bro.
You guys got 2 dudes with laser swords, and they cut through like, I think the same amount of people when they freed you.
Yeah.
Or droids when they freed you.
Yeah, and your guards, what are you supposed to do?
They're not trained for actual combat. They're just trained for some dude to break into the palace looking for cigarettes or something.
What's interesting is I haven't read these books, but there's a book written by, I believe her name is E.K. Johnston called Queen Shadow, and it's about Padme. I believe it's from like 1 and 2, showing her transition from like a queen into a senator, and a lot of that.
I think I read the first 5 pages of that book when I was like 10, and I was like, I'm gonna finish this later, and then I didn't, which is what I do with a lot of books. But that's my only problem. That's
probably Queen Amidala's diary. What I'm talking about is a book that was released, I think, last year in the new canon.
Yeah, I was like 8 last year. Did you know?
That wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, I'm like Anakin. I the next movie comes out and I age like 10 years, and Padme aged like what 2?
We'll get there. Oh geez, we'll get there. But point being, that it's really interesting. This book, Queen Shadow, a lot of the supporting characters are handmaidens. And it really shows the amount of training they go through, and they're like actually like pretty badass women who are like trained to like die for the queen, but also to like defend her like hell. So that's interesting. Kind of runs a little bit in the face of what we see in episode 1.
Can you imagine how stressful it'd be where you have to pose as your boss, and like there are several times throughout the movie where like the fake queen is like telling Padme what to do, and she's like, go do this, go do that, go do this thing. Like, could you imagine having to be in that position? You'd be like, oh fuck, I hope I don't say anything out of line. And then when she's the queen again, like when we're not faking, she's gonna like punish me.
Yeah, I have to assume they like all know it's just like, hey, this is something you like doing, right? they just
probably talk it out in the background beforehand. She's like, all right, you're going to tell me this. I'm thinking about doing this. Make it seem like you're telling me to do this.
Yeah.
Because I'm just supposed to be a handmaiden.
Yeah.
A filthy peasant.
Classism. That's another theme that doesn't go into this movie, but they elect the queen, so we ignore it. Democracy. It's good.
They just talk about that. Like, she's talked about as the queen the whole time, and it's not until like the 3rd act of the movie where she's like, well, I'm elected. I'm an elected official.
Yeah. So yeah, they Jedi of course escape easily, and they get all in their ship, which I love. I love the design of that ship. It speaks perfectly. A lot of people don't like that, like a lot of the ships and designs in the prequel trilogy kind of look cleaner than in the original trilogy, and I get where they're coming from because it's such like a disparity. But again, like looking at Star Wars as a mythology, as like a simple like good versus evil tale, like telling the story of just like this was like the twilight years of like the greatest age ever. Everything's clean, all the technology is moving forward, and you know, you see things in the prequel trilogy that they don't have in the original,
and then we have a fascist government, and all of that invasion is done into like the military and stuff like that. So,
exactly.
Like, yeah.
So that
I also think it kind of
sense.
works because like the ships, the Naboo ships, are very round and very sleek and very simplified, and it's like sort of looks like a 1950s view of what we thought the future was going to look like. Like everything was round and like white or chrome or everything.
Yeah.
And that's what it kind of looks like. And then we're like past that where things are starting to get like Elon Musk just reviewed his new stupid looking car. And
Cybertruck.
And it's just a bunch
Yikes.
of it's just a bunch of polygons.
Yeah.
Like it's just very blocky, and that's what, oddly enough, the original trilogy ships look a lot alike. And I'm like, like it looks cleaner because we have like they're not models, they're not like plastic models just like floating around.
Yeah.
They're CG, or they're like chrome painted models, so they're shinier looking. And I think that's just like a weird thing. But no, like they do, like there are times like where they do look like a little bit more advanced than they probably should be for something being 20-25 years before
Yeah.
the original trilogy.
So yeah, everything with what you said. So they fly off. They get into a little battle is probably understating it. They get absolutely pummeled, and
they get shot a few times.
Yeah,
They're like, oh man, our shields are broken. Send out all the astro droids or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's when we get introduced to R2-D2 of the droid kind. And he
Exactly.
survives by sheer plot armor alone, and I mean that generously, because literally like there's like 8 droids that get sent out there, and like all of them are up there for about 5 seconds, and then R2 plugs a wire in and like hits a button, and then he fixes everything.
Yeah, it's very you look at these movies and you think, you know, there's the Force, there's kind of an element of predestination. There's a lot of debate about how much agency you really have with like, is there a prophecy? Is there, you know, so on and so forth? But a lot of people complain about how the prequel trilogy kind of shrinks the universe with having R2 be in the mix, and you meet C-3PO on Tatooine and all of this stuff. But at the same time, it's just like, look, this is a prequel to the original films. There's going to be, you're relatively staying in the same ballpark. Now, the prequel trilogy expands a lot in terms of like location.
I think what I would have done is I would have been fine if they introduced R2 in this movie, and then they introduced C-3PO in the next one.
I mean, for all intents and purposes of like as we know him, like, I mean, we'll get to it, but it's like he basically is introduced. He's a glorified cameo in this one.
Yeah.
And in the next one, he actually like stays around and like goes on the actual adventure.
That is true. He does things in the next one. So maybe they more or less basically introduce him in the second one. They just give us a glorified cameo.
A tease. You wait 3 years until the next
That's why
one.
he was walking around naked the whole time.
Oh, yikes.
Yeah.
True. So then they go to Tatooine, which is interesting. And I'm not going to like nitpick on this because like location wise, it's like you're going from, they say it's like one of the closest places, but like Tatooine is like super outer rim and Naboo is like mid rim. So that's a little weird, but they hadn't exactly codified that yet. So I'm okay with it. You know, these things happen.
It's one of those things that doesn't become a problem until after the fact.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm willing to let that go. And then another thing, just for, again, I'm going to have half the internet hating me and half of it loving me for this, but there's a big complaint in The Last Jedi about starships not needing fuel and how the whole subplot of a ship running out of fuel is dumb. Well, in this one, episode 1, written and directed by George Lucas, they run out of fuel. You know, in this one, they learn the hyperdrive is leaking, whatever that means. You don't need to know. And then by the time they get to Tatooine, the hyperdrive is gone. Which, you know, it's still physically there. I just assume that means, you know.
No, it just phases out of reality.
Yeah.
It like pieces out and like fades away.
Yeah, true. Either one. We're in this universe.
Anyways, we get to Tatooine, and they're like, oh man, we gotta fix this thing, or else we're just not gonna leave. And like I feel like this is the point where the movie actually starts.
Yeah.
Like the whole 30-40 minutes before this they get to Tatooine, it's like nothing's really kind of happening. Like things are happening, but it seems as almost like a prologue to the actual movie itself.
Yeah.
Especially because
it feels like setup.
Yeah, this is supposed to be the story of like Anakin becoming a Jedi and eventually becoming Darth Vader, and his fall from grace and what all that jazz. And he doesn't show up until like halfway through the movie almost.
Yeah, it's interesting, and there's a lot of, and I'm gonna plan to bring it up later in a separate like end question segment, so I won't ask you now. But that's one of a lot of things that I've heard debated about. Like, if there's one thing you could change about the Phantom Menace, like what would it be? Again, I do appreciate the setup just because of like the intellectual, like, again, political intrigue of it all.
Mm.
But as you know, as I've said, and as you've kind of said, there's like not a lot of whole emotional investment other than like, obviously I don't want this queen assassinated. Obviously I don't want her planet like enslaved or anything.
Yeah, which I think is in part because they are trying to show that Jedi are supposed to be like neutral and passive unless they absolutely have to to intervene, because they just can't feel things, and that's kind of the whole underlying problem with the Jedi, is the repression is apparently the key, and there's other problems which I'm sure we'll touch on when we actually introduce the Jedi proper. We only got 2 so far.
Yeah, that's definitely a thing. So they go to Tatooine, and what I like is that we go to a different location first of all, which I think is nice. Helps diversify the planet. It seems to be a much bigger like hub of things going on than where
Tatooine's third
like Luke
cameo.
goes from. Yeah, basically.
And this is when we notice a trend.
Yes, desert.
Desert in the first movie of the trilogy.
Yes,
desert.
I mean, that does make sense because, I mean, I always assumed Anakin was from Tatooine. You know, then again, I was like a child. For disclaimer, I'm 21. I did not see these movies when they were coming out. But, yeah, that is...
It's fine here.
Yes, exactly.
My only complaint is in the new trilogy when we go to a completely different desert planet, which is more or less the exact same thing.
Yeah, it's like poetry. It rhymes.
Sometimes it's repetitive, too.
True. So they go to Tatooine, and then they need to get new parts, new hyperdrive basically for their ship. Qui-Gon goes alone, and I get why they do this, but I kind of my big complaint is that
he's like telling Obi-Wan, he's like, you're in charge until I get back.
Yeah.
But make sure they don't do anything because they might find us or whatever. And then they have a scene later on where they get a transmission or whatever. And like Obi-Wan's only words like, do not send a transmission back. And then he leaves the room and doesn't give them any sort of explanation. He's just like, don't do it.
Yeah.
I was like, okay.
I mean, I get why you do. It does make logical sense for the Protector to be there, but I also think in a way that Obi-Wan kind of takes a back seat, and of course we do get a lot of him
in the next
movies.
2. But like this is also in part his story as well.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that they give so much attention to Qui-Gon, and I think it's in part to give like Anakin that father figure.
Yes.
To impress on him, because
definitely
he's space baby Jesus, and that he's literally born without a dad having any involvement at all. There is no father. Like there's Anakin's mom just woke up one morning and she's like, oh man, I'm pregnant.
Yeah, there's been in both the old canon and even in the new canon, it's been basically implied in the new canon that Sidious, Palpatine, and his master tried to create life from the Force, and that they thought they failed, but they just realized
the Y chromosome. They still need the X chromosome, so
yeah, they just thought like, oh, nothing appeared in front of us, but like it just happened somewhere else, because the will of the Force will always like fuck with people trying to like do their own shit, which is
makes
interesting.
That whole baby Jesus, not even an allegory, just straight copy, like less ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's still stupid. I still hate it. I hate it more than the midichlorian existing.
Well, we'll tackle both of those things soon. Then we get to Watto, who's the second character. Third character with problematic accents and look, because
and actions.
Yeah,
He is very much I didn't notice this when people would talk about it as I got older, because I'd only seen the Phantom Menace like twice, maybe before this. And so, like, when people are just like, "Oh yeah, he's a Jewish stereotype," I'm like looking at it and I'm like, "Oh yeah, I guess you could be right." But no, watching this movie, like, like he's like, there's a scene who's like, "Money's no good here." Like he's like, "Your credit's no good here. Only money like speaks to me or whatever." Or no, it's when Qui-Gon Jinn's trying to like trying to use his mind tricks on him, and he's like, "Mind tricks don't work on me, on my species. Only money." And it's like that accent and like the weird like elephant looking nose thing that he's got like replicates the big nose Jewish stereotype. And also just like the fact that he's like, only money speaks to me. It's like, oh god.
Yeah, it's
that's a little too on the nose.
It's
pun not intended.
It definitely oof. It definitely hasn't aged well. The Toydarians make a more Watto of course returns in the next episode, but and then in the Clone Wars, it's made clear that not all Toydarians talk like that, which is good. You know, it isolates the stereotype from being an entire species to an entire person, which still ain't great, but you know, improvement.
The evils.
Yes, true. So again, interesting stuff there, and then we get introduced to young Anakin. Now, before we say anything, I'm going to again clarify that the abuse that Jake Lloyd suffered is absolute dog shit.
Oh yeah, didn't he stop acting from just because of the amount of?
Yeah, he stopped acting. Issues? He's a bunch of, I believe right now he's in rehab. If that's wrong as of this recording, you know.
I didn't even know. Yeah. I don't know anything about his life.
So he's had a troubled life. And I'm not saying... and some of it wasn't just like drugs or stuff that he did to himself. And again, you know, this is going off of memory. So I'm not disparaging the guy at all. It's just... It's very unfortunate. And it's just kind of like, I think, you know, this is a larger topic of conversation. But how, you know, negative a force like fandom can be, especially in this like age of the internet where like anybody's voice can matter, even if their voice, you know, shouldn't, because like he was a, you know, his acting, and what the one thing I'll give him is that his acting is very earnest, like, which is very good for a young Anakin.
Like people like to complain about child acting, but acting is difficult.
Oh yeah.
Especially when you're a child who like doesn't quite know how to convey emotions just in regular conversation, let alone when you have to basically fake those emotions.
Exactly. And
like child actors that are like really, really popular, like honestly they got lucky and they probably got a lot of training. Like I think they got this kid almost basically off the streets.
Yeah, they did the classic thing of a lot of, not a lot of unknown actors, because Liam Neeson was a known name. Ewan McGregor of course got like gigantic because of these movies, but like he's, you know,
he was still unknown at the time.
Yeah, and then Natalie Portman had done a bunch of
Natalie
good
Portman
stuff.
Was a child actor. And
Leon the Professional, great movie. Point being though that the fandom didn't help Jake Lloyd with his growing pains, and like I get, you know, you don't like seeing subpar acting in your favorite acting franchise, but the kid is a kid.
I would argue a lot of the acting in this first movie wasn't exactly the best. From anyone, even Liam Neeson a few times, I was just like,
But most of them know how to like carry it with enough sincerity that you can believe that these are actual characters. And as I said, you know, young Anakin, if nothing else, comes off as earnest, even if, you know, the emotions might not be believable all the time. I can still believe this is a kid who has had a hard life, who, you know, wants to get out, who has dreams of making it big, who has, you know, more hope than most slaves ever do.
Yeah, and a lot of my issues with most of his characters, honestly, just the writing itself.
Yeah.
It's not like awful, it's just not natural.
Yeah, and I'm not gonna hate on a kid for directing and like that's, you know, that's doing dumb. What he's told. And even if he did write his own lines, which, you know, he didn't, that's a dumb scenario. Don't, you know, but even if he did do that, I'm still not going to hate on him. You know, that's stupid. But yeah, he's an earnest kid, and I think, you know, one of the things that's often said is like that the romantic angle between him and Padme is a little creepy, because in
this movie it comes off more as a sibling kind of thing. And I'm gonna also blame the writing. A lot of my complaints is honestly just the writing. Which I mean is a big complaint you can make about Star Wars in general, at least up until the new trilogy, because all of the original 6 films were by George Lucas, and he had help with some of them, but for the most part they were his thing. And his writing of people is renowned for not being the most authentic or realistic. Especially the romantic angles of things.
Anakin and Padme, to me it makes sense why he's drawn to her. It's very like first pretty girl you see.
Are you an angel?
Yeah, let's ignore that.
I love that line because that actually sounds like something a kid would say to some random stranger.
It is.
Yeah.
To be fair,
that was an authentic line to me.
And he's very, as I said, and I keep, I'm going to say this till I'm blue in the face, but earnest. When they're in the, when it's the scene where they're all having dinner at his table, and he says something along the lines of like, you say the biggest problem in this universe is that nobody helps each other. And you see right from the core that Anakin, despite all of his flaws that he'll later that'll be exacerbated by like the Jedi training, is that he cares, arguably too much, but he cares a lot.
A lot of his motivations through a lot of the trilogy aren't selfish. They are definitely for the people he cares about.
Not. Yeah.
Especially the women in his life, because as this movie reveals, he is like basically just not necessarily abducted because he kind of wants to go, but he is basically just taken from his mom. Yeah. And they're like, oh yeah, you're probably never going to see her again.
Yeah, he's taking an uninformed decision basically.
Yeah.
But yeah, what I could analyze out of Padme being drawn to him, at least as a person, not necessarily romantically, is that she's in a very tough situation right now where it seems that like the Jedi are doing a job. Her guards, obviously care, but they can't do anything. She has her handmaidens, which are like basically like sisters to her, but she doesn't feel like anybody outside of that like cares what's happening. And to see this kid probably, maybe remind her of herself when she was younger, and obviously getting into politics very young, that interests me on that level. And that isn't, again, really explored because it's, as I said, George Lucas, very like simple ideas that, are conveyed well. I still, for the most part, with obviously they care about each other.
Man. Yeah. Sometimes better than a critical commentary. I do think like a thing that we should touch on with Padme is that she is Queen Amidala, and we talked about her having the
spoiler alert for a movie that is 20 years old.
Yeah, she's Queen Amidala, and she has her like duplicates that they trade body in to like protect her, and like so that way she can, I don't know, escape and like not be in the limelight when she doesn't want to.
Yeah,
and they play the part really well, but they don't. What this movie does is it alludes a couple times that she is the actual real queen, because they don't really do that. I think she shows up as like the queen in her first scene, and then after that it's her like stunt double.
Yeah, Keira Knightley
plays her stunt double.
Yeah.
Throughout the whole movie. And it's probably noticeable if like you're paying attention. Like I think about halfway through the movie I was like, oh yeah, that's right, that is Keira Knightley. Even though it's like obvious because Padme like switches out or whatever, but because they're wearing like all that makeup, it's kind of hard to tell.
Yeah,
when they do
it's
the
less
switch.
obvious.
Yeah. Especially me, who like doesn't recognize faces for anything. I'm awful with faces, but like there's a few times where they allude to it, like when one of the guards, when they're on Tatooine, he like goes up to Qui-Gon and he's like, hey yo, one of the Queen's handmaidens is going with you, and he's like, I don't want anyone else to go with me. He's like, well, the Queen just wants to know what like she wants to experience the planet. Like she's, and like it's like supposed to be sort of an allusion to the fact that that's the Queen.
Yeah.
And like Qui-Gon probably picks up on it. It's just like, fine.
Yeah, I mean,
and takes it with her, but like as an audience member, especially if you're like younger or you're just like
I didn't pick up on it the first time.
Or if you're just me and you're stupid, like I was like watching it and I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Like knowing how this ends, like is what tuned me into that. But if I was watching this for the first time, I'd be like, huh? And then when it does reveal, when they finally reveal that she's the actual queen, it feels like it's almost coming out of left field a little bit, because like the illusions just aren't obvious enough, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's well in the fact that you can definitely pick up on it on rewatches. Like you can tell that at least Qui-Gon knows, at least very early on, because there's a point, skipping ahead a bit, where the pod race is about to start, and the Padme says like. Or Qui-Gon says, the Queen trusts my judgment. But basically in the interaction, it's very clear that he's basically challenging her to reveal to him that she's the Queen. If it's really important to her, that he, stop doing this and that he do something else. He was like, okay, tell me what to do then. But then she basically doesn't go along with that. Whether that's for safety or for some other reason, I do think that's a good scene. And it does show that I do think, George Lucas isn't a bad writer. I think there are ideas that he simply, as a writer, doesn't have as many strengths as, and that's true for everybody. Yeah. But those lacking of strength are perhaps more obvious than other writers.
Yeah. I think it's just more obvious because around this time it was mostly like George Lucas had already created the original Star Wars trilogy, and
Right.
those had 20 years to basically develop in people's minds as these great things.
Yeah.
And so George Lucas was sort of renowned as this like brilliant masterpiece of man, Steven Spielberg levels maybe. And so when he goes in to make the prequel trilogies, he probably brought back a lot of his original crew, but he probably has a lot of new people, and they're just like, you're the man. You know what to do. You tell us what to do, and we'll do it. And like they didn't really have anyone going like they didn't really have a Harrison Ford or like the person who directed Empire,
Irvin Kershner.
They didn't have those. He probably didn't quite have those people going like, well, hold up. What if we went with this angle? What if we did that? Like he didn't have that sort of thoughts to bounce off people. Like it's probably just him going like, what if we did this? And everyone's just like, well, you're the man. Yeah, we'll do it. Which is probably an issue that a lot of people who get big probably have this. Like,
I mean, people need to know there are creative limits, and people need to. Some people don't know when they've reached theirs, and it's always a balancing act, finding out when to push the envelope and maybe when to rein it in a bit. There's no, in a lot of ways, there's no right answers. Art is subjective. If this is your favorite movie, then
Please let me know.
Fuck us.
I want to know
exactly. Blasting through Tatooine because this section of the movie is super long.
Which takes 15 minutes and also had like 20 minutes almost cut off from that. Like it was a big chunk.
Yeah, it's shot really well. I will say this for it is that again, George Lucas as a visual director is I think, exemplary, definitely, among, top 10 of, the past 50 or so years in that, I can follow everything that's going along. Everything looks great. It pretty much holds up. It probably helps that everything's moving very fast, but...
Yeah, I think the thing that helps the sort of dated CGI work is that a lot of the CGI is used in instances where things are moving fast, so you can't really focus on how great it looks because when they're moving fast, it looks fine.
Yeah. So that's all well and good. The music is tense. I can follow along the action as much as I enjoy most of the Marvel films, and of course we will be talking about them on this podcast at some point.
Oh yeah, I have opinions on those too. Some people probably won't like some of them.
We all have opinions on those. But a lot of the action in those movies, I can't follow along for crap. It's exhilarating and adrenaline, rushing in the moment, and I enjoy it, but I can't look back and think of specific shots, really. Now, Phantom Menace isn't my favorite movie, but I can still do that, particularly with the pod race sequence.
Yeah, the action scenes in a lot of the Star Wars are usually pretty well to follow and easy to follow, and the choreography is usually pretty good when they really want it to be. It's usually pretty good all around. But like in this trilogy specifically, the choreography is done way more dynamic, and we get a sense of feel of what like the Jedi could do when they were in their prime.
Yes, definitely.
On, especially in the later movies after this one.
Yeah. So Anakin wins the race because everybody either dies, gets maimed, or their ship, gets destroyed. As I said, which is
Anakin wins by technicality.
Yeah, questionable methods, but I respect it. Then he wins. He gets the prize money. He gets freed. We didn't really talk about this.
Qui-Gon bet Anakin's freedom. Well, he bet both Anakin and his mom's freedom, but Watto was like
only one.
Only one. That's too much. And then he rolls a dice, and forgetting that like Qui-Gon does Jedi mind tricks or whatever, Qui-Gon flips the dice in his favor.
Yeah, I think he realizes it, but he's also so overconfident that he's just like, screw it, it doesn't matter.
Yeah,
like and then, he's overconfident. He's greedy.
Qui-Gon takes Anakin with him to Coruscant to be trained for Jedi because he's like, this boy is strong in the Force. He's baby Jesus.
One last thing I'll say on Tatooine: the scene of him leaving his mother probably is the most emotionally touching for me. His general overall story.
It's very tragic. Like it makes sense on why he becomes so emotionally stunted as he gets older because he's this boy. Like most Jedi children, when they go to become younglings, they're toddlers. They're either toddlers or they're basically taken almost right from birth. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't really specify how the Jedi go about taking them. Like if they're just like, hey, yo, can we take your child? Yes, no, whatever. Or they just go up and they're like, oh yeah, this kid's got strong Force powers. We're taking him with us. And they basically like kidnap these children.
Yeah.
Which they may or more or less have done with Anakin because they don't really give him too much informed consent until they're literally leaving and they're like, oh yeah, you may never see your mom again. And he's like, okay, and he's already 9, so he's already got this attachment to his mother.
Exactly.
And so like he is, and he even talks about it. It's like, I'm sad because I left my mom, and like he's thinking about his mom. And they talk about that, and that's why the Jedi are like, we're not going to train this boy.
Yeah.
So they get his hopes up, and then they're basically like, now throw him back on the planet with his slave mom. Now that he's a free boy, a free elf.
Yeah, I wanna save the big Jedi. The problem with the Jedi in Episode 3, because that's when it really that's when everything hits the fan. But that's definitely a big part of it.
The Jedi do the equivalent in Episode 3 of like what a lot of religious families do, and they're just like, oh yeah, just pray on it, and all your problems will be solved.
Yeah,
and Anakin's like.
Not to crap on religious people, I myself am religious, but there is that. I mean, I think a lot of people know that that is an ethos in a lot of things. Is that the most toxic variant of that is like, don't try and do anything personally, don't talk to your friends, just pray on it, because that's literally all you'll ever need. So that there's definitely an aspect of that.
For some people, maybe that works to an extent, but it's not a universal thing. As with the case with Anakin. Obi-Wan probably was taken when he was like a toddler and became relatively well-adjusted, but Anakin was taken at the age of 9 when he's already got attachments to his family and personal struggles and views, because he wasn't raised in a temple in this sort of higher class society than he grew up in.
Yeah. Then there's a big action sequence of Qui-Gon fighting Darth Maul and Anakin having to tell Obi-Wan and the pilot to get their shit together so that they can leave. It's an alright action sequence. It kind of displays how much of a threat Darth Maul is, even though it's probably not the most well shot of any of the action set pieces so far. It still establishes this is a person, first of all, who has another lightsaber and can move very quickly, and it's something that leaves Qui-Gon Jinn visibly like winded when he gets onto the ship. So it establishes him as a credible threat. And of course he looks terrifying as all hell when he's introduced, even though it's very silly how he like walks into a hologram basically. It's very intimidating. And this is something sad that I found out about just the other day. I'm not sure if this is in Legends continuity or current continuity, but at some point, like in the future, where like Anakin has like started his training, Shmi, his mom, and a bunch of her friends basically save up like money, like the few earnings they get as slaves, because they get like small
they get enough to get food.
They save that up to send a message to Coruscant, to the Jedi Temple, to ask, how's my son doing, basically.
Let me guess, the Jedi basically just like hide that away and don't show him?
Basically, they get a response back that's something along the lines of, sorry, civilians are not privy to like temple information.
Yeah.
Which is like, makes me despise the Jedi Order in terms of like their dogma even more. One thing I will say is that probably my favorite scene, so we get to like, we're going to Coruscant, and then Padme is like there, she like watches a message from one of her people that say they're like,
we're dying.
Yeah, they're dying.
We're getting thrown.
We need help.
Yeah.
And she interacts with Anakin, and it's probably my favorite interaction of the two of them in this film, just because it's very genuine and intimate, and the dialogue, at least for me, works really well, because it's, talking about, space being cold and kind of, this warmth they find in each other.
Like trying to comfort each other.
Yeah, and it's mutual, because even if it's not in a romantic way, these are two people who have like gone kind of through an adventure together, and they know where each other are coming from. And it's not, Anakin is young, but he has a sense of like, at least he's a slave, he's been through a lot, he has enough emotional maturity to
and he's just a very empathetic kid, as we've been given a clue on, because he's like, we gotta help other people, and I want to help my mom get out of here, and like I want to help the Jedi, and
exactly
all these things. Like the very first action, one of the very first actions he does in this movie is like offer Qui-Gon and Padme and R2 and Jar Jar.
He saves Jar Jar Binks' ass.
Yeah, he saves Jar Jar. Like he's a very empathetic child.
Yeah, so seeing them two come together and basically be like, we don't know if this is going to be like the last time we're like really around each other, like in private, to just be like basically like a young teenager and a very older kid. It's a very like kind of stripped down
They're
moment.
like they're like siblings.
Yeah.
Comforting each other.
Yeah. Point is there's a connection.
Yeah.
And I appreciate it.
I get a very sibling vibe from them. This movie specifically.
Yeah.
Less so in the later 2 movies, but like in this movie. And it might just be because they're both Anakin's actor is like 10 or 9 or whatever at this time. The age that he's supposed to be, and Padme is supposed to be like 14.
Yes.
And so like they do have this very sibling vibe because they're not that they're not old enough to develop romantic feelings, but like they're just not really focusing on that. Like the way it's written just doesn't come off that way to me.
Exactly. But yeah, he gives her like this Japor snippet, this like basically like wood carving. I didn't know Tatooine had wood, but that's cool.
It's all fossilized wood.
Oh yeah,
Tatooine's all filmed in Arizona. It works.
Yikes. But yeah, that's a fun part, and that comes up later, and that's a fun bit. And then we get introduced to Coruscant, an ecumenopolis, as I learned is the technical term for it, a planet that is a city. Ecumenopolis. I think that's a cool word. You learn something new every day.
Right?
But
they get there, they have this whole... everyone splits up and goes their own ways. Anakin goes to the Jedi Council, and like they're doing like a stupid like litmus test. They're showing him little ink blots.
Yeah. Well, first he goes with the Queen, but then he goes to the temple after Qui-Gon.
He goes there, and they're like
report.
asking questions, and he's like talking about his mom and like stuff like that. And they're like, "Oh yeah, you missed your mom?" And he's like, "Yeah, I miss my mom. I'm 9."
Yeah.
And they're like, "Well, you shouldn't." And he's like, "But I'm 9."
Yeah. The whole idea of like, I mean, I get it. Like if you are detached enough to not take things too personally, and for like a Jedi, their emotions literally like become their powers, so that's like a bad thing. But you know, just only getting briefly into it, like if you don't have the emotional maturity and know how to deal with things properly, you're not going to be able to put that healthy distance between you and like whatever you're going through. So if you tell someone who's used to not doing that to just not do that anymore, that's not gonna work.
A child who is not emotionally mature.
Yeah, and this in a way parallels Padme, the Queen, not being really emotionally... Certainly she's in an emotionally vulnerable place, and even though she's been in politics, she's very trusting of Senator Palpatine, which, spoiler alert, is like the big bad of basically like, now we're finding out like this entire 9
it's a
movie
very
saga.
on the nose like scene, because we all know at least as we get older how this whole story thing pans out, but even as you're watching this, you're like, this guy kind of has villain vibes.
He's
very on the nose on how he manipulates her to like basically help get him in power. But like when you're looking at this from the perspective of like a 14 or 16-year-old who is a queen of an entire nation whose only goal is to help her people and make sure that they live, like it's sort of
it's reasonable.
It's well done. Like you don't really have to try that hard to manipulate a child.
Yeah, Palpatine is very interesting because in this film, probably the most out of any of them, he comes off as a very like kind-hearted,
he does
reasonable man who he can play the game of politics very well, but he comes off as reluctant of doing so. He's just like, we have to do this to get things done. I don't like it, but this is how they are. And that's very good in a type of character like that, because that type of character, even though like we know his true motivations, to someone like Padme,
he wants absolute power, but he has to go through all the motions to get it. It's very tedious. Like he probably really does not like having to do all of this work around.
But it's very clever, because to get that level of power, you have to be very reluctant. You have to be like, this is a great burden on me. And even
I
in this,
will take it.
and even in this movie, he's not really advocating power for himself. I mean, he is in a very indirect way, but
trying to be like, someone needs to have the absolute power.
And it's a perfect thing, because he's, people forget, like, Palpatine, the Emperor, is from Naboo. So like he mentions he mentions he's a senator from there. So it like he manufactures this conflict probably on purpose to happen on his own planet. To get sympathy for him and the Queen, who is, a very young woman who's probably very fiery, is a fiery woman, and, it works out brilliantly for him, because we go into the Senate scene, and it's just, it's gridlock. Nothing is getting done. The first, the Trade Federation has a seat in the Senate, which, talking about like modern politics or just like political themes in general is terrifying.
That has power in a somewhat democratic constitution that is the Senate. And it's like a business is just sort of there and being able to give their opinions and being like, well, we didn't do this. We're not at fault.
Yeah, I find it interesting that basically every senator is just like for the vote of no confidence, and it probably just took someone who was like that politically like brave enough and willing to like throw themselves into the fire, because like likely everybody was not getting done what they wanted to get done.
Mm-hmm.
So like this opportunity to like actually get change for their systems and for like things to go smoother probably goes
I want one of
over
those political dramas,
really well.
but it's just a Star Wars drama. Disney Plus, get on it.
Yes. I'll jump back into like the Jedi Council stuff for a second, because then we basically go back to Naboo.
Yeah,
basically,
this is around the time where she's just like, well, like everything's gonna take way too long to get done. My people are probably gonna be dead. I'm gonna go home, and I'd rather just die with them than just be a coward and be on another planet and wait for them to die.
Which I find is interesting, because Palpatine, the political, mastermind, the guy who plans for everything, seems to be taken off guard by this. Now, whether that's like him feigning as a character being like, no, stay here, or
he's
whether
like Willy Wonka's like, no.
But he says to like the Nemoidians later, to the head one, that he's like, her coming back is an unexpected move. So it probably still
like almost immediately after that, it's like, killed him.
Yeah, let's be real. Eventually, I mean, he got elected, definitely.
Yeah.
So eventually, he probably would have like either told the Nemoidians to back off on his end of things, or ensured that they lost, or maybe he had a plan if they actually won and kept the planet. But it's very interesting to see that in this small little way, she does something unexpected for him. And then going back to the Jedi Council side of things, Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan obviously need to go back. They take the kid with them, which I get, why they do. From like a story point of view, you want him to be an active participant. Still a very bad idea, taking a kid into a war zone.
Yeah, they could have just left him on the ship or something.
But I get it.
Yeah, they storm the palace they get the Gungans to help, and that's a whole thing. That's Jar Jar's redemption arc.
Yeah, it's
that whole happens, and that's when they reveal that Padme is actually the queen
to the audience.
Yeah, to the audience, and everyone's just like, oh, okay, except for like the two Jedi that are there. They're just like,
yeah, they just glance at each other. Yeah, they're like, I'd like to think there's like a bet going on between them, and Obi-Wan's just like, damn, I owe you 5, don't I? But yeah,
they storm the palace. They do that whole thing. The ships, like they free a bunch of the pilots or whatever, and they get them in the ships, and they get them to launch themselves off and try and take down one of the command ships or whatever. And so they try and do that whole shebang.
Yeah.
And then we get Darth Maul shows up again, and this time it's the final fight, and so we get our good John Williams song.
Yeah. Who's been gold. He's gold throughout all these movies, to be honest. Even if the themes aren't bombastic or anything, they always add to the.
They are very memorable, which I think is the most important part of a movie's soundtrack, is that there has to be songs that stick with you.
Yeah. So yeah, a lot starts to happen, particularly starting out with the Gungans and making peace. It's again very simple, very mythological, like fable storytelling, where it's just like, oh, you don't think you're better than us? Yeah, we can be friends. Kind of.
I have no idea why they do that.
Lord,
it's so
I find it interesting. Again, obviously, themes of colonialism can take up an entire film, not to mention, a subplot. What I do think is interesting, and I think kind of borrows from Return of the Jedi a little bit, is this theme of like nature and like democracy, or just like pure like natural forces versus the forces of like evil and technology and the military industrial complex. Because in Return of the Jedi, you got the Ewoks versus the Empire, and no matter how you feel about that, that is a theme there, and the Ewoks win. And similarly here, the Gungans, even though they almost lose, basically, there's still that theme
put up a good little bit of a fight.
Yeah, evil versus
technology.
Good. Yeah, it's like poetry. It rhymes.
Man versus nature, man. That whole dichotomy.
Exactly.
But yeah, they storm the palace. They do that whole shebang. They tell Anakin to wait in the ship or whatever, and then eventually he like trips on a switch or whatever, and him and R2 fly off into space to go blow up the thing.
Yeah. I think as ridiculous as that is, like it, you kind of got to, it's Star Wars, it's mythology, it's Anakin.
Yeah, this is where we got our first Mary Sue.
Yeah,
I think our biggest Mary Sue, because Anakin is a 10-year-old boy whose only piloting is done on these pod racers, which only have like one sort of way of movement, which is left, right, and
for so the most part.
And now he has like all 360 degrees in a spaceship of movement, and he like kind of picks up on that within a few minutes. Yeah. And like he is, granted, they do say early on that he is very smart with technology and figuring these things out, but it's also just
and the Force helps. Yeah,
and the Force. So his midichlorian count is way too high. It's higher than Yoda's.
Yeah.
How did no one complain about this being a Mary Sue? Would they complain about Rey?
Yeah, I think it goes back. Reason. It goes it goes back to the whole like nature of prequels. You expect Anakin to be overpowered and to be able to do things, and Rey is a new character.
I don't overpowered later, at the age of like 10, when he's never been off world.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
And like I'm not even really complaining about it. I'm just pointing that out because other people like to complain about Rey.
Yeah, I mean the whole point in this movie is that the Force acts as like it's in a very general sense it's a superpower, but in a mythological sense it's this sense of agency and you being able to enact change upon the world. And in terms of like Anakin's character and what he wants to do in the galaxy and just his like whole like mentality at the time, I think that is it a little ridiculous if you take this hyper realistic like world building stance? Sure, maybe. I don't even
too realistically.
I don't even have that complaint with Rey. And if you're bothered by Rey and not Anakin or Luke, then you might have a problem. But
only a little bit.
Yeah,
but like it's a thing that happens, and then we have the whole John Williams Duel of the Fates fight thing going on.
Definitely top 5 in what he's done. Maybe not all time, but in Star Wars, definitely top 5.
It's a good song. You mentioned when we were watching the movie that it's sort of like it gives this feel of that this Jedi versus the Sith battle has been going on for millennium, especially with like the choral aspects and everything.
I mean, the name is Duel of the Fates. Yeah. That's like how typical like light versus the darkness can you get.
They have that laser door scene around the climax of the fight, more or less.
Yeah.
And that is sort of weird. Like if we're looking at this from a realistic thing, it's like why are those there and why are those like just
what are those
go on in sequence? Like what is the point? But whatever, it's there for a set piece and it works fine as a set piece. There's that one point where they're all just sort of waiting for the lasers to like open up again so they can run back through and fight each other, and Qui-Gon just pops a squat on the floor and just sort of meditates for a little bit, and I just like that's funny.
Yeah, I mean it does showcase the mentality of all 3 fighters. It's definitely the mentality of the Sith that it's like the dark side is all about like bending the Force kind of to your will.
Yeah.
So you have all this energy and you can't help but
I like that he taps a laser.
Yeah.
As sort of like to tell the audience like, oh, we can't just go through this. Like we gotta wait.
Yeah. And then Qui-Gon is all about kind of the quintessential Jedi is just like meditating passively, like waiting. It'll turn off. He can wait till then, and then
Anyways, back to the fight.
Yeah.
We have Qui-Gon over here in the corner waiting at 230 pounds. And Qui-Gon and
gets stabbed in the back.
Yeah, he gets punched in the face or like gets whacked in the face with the hilt or whatever, and then he gets stabbed. And Obi-Wan is like no, and then he waits for his door to open because he's stuck behind a door because he tripped and fell.
Yeah.
And then so like they continue their fight, and Obi-Wan, who's probably because he's angry because he just lost his dad, his dad figure, not his actual dad. Anyways, he
fights very aggressively.
Managed to take down that double-hilted lightsaber, the only one we see in the whole trilogy, I think, actually.
Yeah,
actual
in all of live action, the whole trilogy. Yeah,
the whole series. He cuts it in half. There's only one lightsaber, so they're fighting kind of on even ground. And then he gets kicked over the thing, and Darth Maul kicks his lightsaber off the thing, and then he just sort of like whacks his lightsaber a few times. Against the bottom of the thing, and I'm like. Probably not very effective.
He's mad.
I'd probably do the same thing. I'd be like, oh, what you gonna do? You gonna get up here, do it.
Yeah. What I do like about at this point is that, we've had 3 battles, kind of 4 technically, going on concurrently. You have the Gungans versus the droid army in like the fields. Then you have Anakin and like all the other fighters up in space. And then you have the Queen trying to get to the throne room.
Trying to get to the throne room.
And then obviously the Jedi. And again, this is where George Lucas's like brilliance and like timing, even though there's like pacing issues with the pod racing here at the end, it's very tight because you have the climax of basically all of these points
have to get
not just the
wrapped up.
climaxes, but like the low points of like when you think everybody is about to lose, all happen relatively at about the same time, and then each of them start to like win kind
Yeah.
of because of the same thing, because
Because
Anakin accidentally blows.
yeah, Anakin accidentally blows up something a very important, like, I don't know, like bearing
Basically
on
the
ship
reactor or
and
something.
blows up the ship or whatever, and like that's when all the droids shut down on the battle with the Gungans, and they're like, oh wait, they're not working anymore, we win.
Yeah.
And then that's when, like, around the exact same time that Padme makes it to the throne room, and like they
Takes out all the droids.
Yeah, they take out all the droids and they arrest the Japanese stereotypes. And then and then that all happens, and then Qui-Gon dies. That's the low point, and then like Obi-Wan,
and he's hanging from the thing.
Obi-Wan does a sick flip and grabs Qui-Gon's lightsaber with the Force, and then immediately slices
Bisects
Darth Maul, and then Darth Maul falls down the shaft, and then we'll never see him again.
Yeah,
ever.
Except
he's gone. He's gone.
Point being, though, they all win. There's some like nice wrap up. One thing I will say is that we get a lot of, you know, Qui-Gon laying there dying, basically asks Obi-Wan as his dying wish to train Anakin. What I find interesting is that I've seen this explored in, like, I'll be honest, I read fan fiction. I've seen this explored that it's very interesting that Qui-Gon's words are about someone else and not, you know, his apprentice that he's trained, and how that's like a chip on Obi-Wan's shoulder almost, that towards the end of his life, Qui-Gon cared more about this kid than he did about his apprentice, which I don't think is completely true, because they do have this conversation earlier about how Qui-Gon respects Obi-Wan and thinks that eventually he'll be a greater Jedi than he ever is, which, you know, obviously it's a very subjective point, but like by episode 3, he's definitely like a experienced, wise Jedi, a warrior, a great warrior.
Alec Guinness.
Yeah.
He becomes Alec Guinness, and that's sort of his sort of character evolution too. Because although Jedi are supposed to be very objective and non-feeling, like Obi-Wan and Anakin's relationship does come off like they conflict a lot because they are like older siblings and they're gonna butt heads and stuff like that. But they do genuinely care about each other. And then like as Obi-Wan gets to his end of his character arc, he becomes a lot like the Jedi hive mind in a way, but also he still has his opinions because he's raised by Qui-Gon, and so he still develops his opinions in ways that he's like, I don't like he's a lot of times his character comes off as like, I don't necessarily agree with what the council is telling me to do or how to go about this thing, but like I gotta do it to the best of my ability, the way they'd like it, because then they're gonna give me crap about it, and then I'm gonna have to deal with it, and I don't want to deal with my parents right now.
That's basically the attitude. But so all of that wraps up, and then there's basically like an ending scene where that like wraps up the whole like Trade Federation, like Naboo freedom subplot, where the main two
they all throw a party.
The Trade Federation guys are taken away, and stuff. And then there's...
The Jedi Council finally agrees to train Anakin after they said no.
I find it interesting that Yoda tells Obi-Wan that the Council has agreed that Anakin should be trained, but he doesn't, which I find very
he's the leader
interesting.
Of the hive mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because in like the old EU, like Mace Windu was the leader for the council for a bit instead of Yoda, but then like it switched back to Yoda. So that's like a weird thing that doesn't really mesh with things. But what I find interesting about that is that probably like everyone on the council is probably a lot younger than Yoda is. So the fact that, you know, a Sith has, you know, been definitively like brought back, they're going to need, if like Anakin truly is the chosen one, then they're literally, if you take the prophecy to be at face value true, they're going to need him.
Which is why Anakin is probably able to skip like the young Link training and stuff like that. Like he pretty much goes straight into being bad.
Or at least he like bypasses it very quickly.
You can argue it's probably age, but it's probably just because they're like, we gotta expedite this whole as much as we can skip through.
He's probably more powerful.
Takes like a decade.
Yeah, he's more powerful. It's his age, and probably more of that speeding
Mary
up.
Sue.
No.
I'm just kidding. No, that one's not a Mary Sue.
Also, like Obi-Wan is probably like looked at as like, you should be the one to train him, because like the Sith have been gone for, like, they say millennia, so for a long time. So he basically becomes the first person in modern memory who's defeated a Sith, and as far as they know, and you know, in the canon up to this point when they were making this film, Darth Maul is dead. So that's, you know,
as he should be.
Agree to disagree. So then the funeral pyre scene happens because it's a
Yeah,
tradition that Jedi, when they die, are
leave nothing left.
burned because they're, you know, the
Like
body
the
isn't
funeral.
really important. It's the Force. It's their spirit that's like they've become one with the Force, so their body is not
Anakin
necessarily
watches his dad
important
figure
anymore.
burned to the stake.
We don't
Probably
think
the
about
first-
that.
The first death he's probably ever seen firsthand like that.
Yeah.
First funeral he might have only ever been to. I mean, he was a slave. He probably didn't really have a lot of those members.
Most likely, probably the first person he's really cared about too, and it's a good scene. There's some good foreshadowing, if a bit obvious in hindsight, where Yoda and Mace Windu are discussing the Sith Lord or the Sith apprentice that Obi-Wan defeated and wondering who the Master is, and then there's there's a cut to like the people in the funeral, and it's very very deliberately shot in an angle where you can see like the side of like Palpatine's face that you would have seen in the hood. So if you're really paying attention and you're really good at noticing
I
angles,
didn't catch
you would
that.
be good at.
I had to watch the movie a second time in a row.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah, I'll do that again.
But yeah, then there's the big party, which is kind of, in some ways.
I mentioned it's sort of a reference to like the Ewok party of destroying the Empire, but this time instead of it being at the end of the trilogy, it's at the beginning before things really get into the meat of things. It's like, yeah, we saved it. We beat up this thing. We blew up the big spaceship in the sky, sort of thing. And then like it's like sort of like the prologue, the beginning of this story.
Yeah.
Celebration, celebrating like, ooh, here's the party just beginning, and then like we have the Ewok one at the end of this saga of Anakin saga.
Yeah, it's
at the end of that movie as well.
It's definitely interesting because it's in this moment that I think the title, the meaning of the title Phantom Menace really becomes clear, because obviously the like literal threat of the Phantom Menace is the Sith, but when you get down to like thematically, like textually, like looking,
he's just he's just a symptom. Like Darth Maul's just the symptom.
Yeah, and it's not that like we defeated the Trade Federation, yay, things are great. The Phantom Menace is like everything that's about to come, and in a way that is literally Darth Sidious and what the machinations of what he's going to do, and the darkness, and how he's going to rot the Republic from the inside out, basically. But I do find it that like basically that they're about to basically experience their very long death, and it begins in a celebration with Palpatine, the new Chancellor, basically being at this celebration of peace and harmony between the natives and the governmental people, and you have Anakin and Obi-Wan there, you have Yoda, you have basically all the major players who are gathering.
The entire like Jedi Council is just on that planet celebrating too.
Exactly. So you have basically the whole cast, technically speaking. Obviously, there's a different actor for Anakin, but you have all the characters there that are basically celebrating the end. Of like, this is the last time everything is going to be good. Obviously, there's a gap of like 10 years between Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, the next film, but
was that actually 10 years?
It's about that time because he ages. Anyways, but yeah, that's how that goes, and that's basically the film, really. And Verdict, it hasn't really moved up in my ranking at all through kind of talking it out. I've probably gained a more intellectual appreciation for what this film tries to do, but again, as I said, not really a whole lot of emotional investment. I do appreciate the CGI Yoda as in
as the original Muppet that they used for the original release of this movie.
It didn't look like a good puppet. One last thing I'll ask you before we conclude this episode is a little game I want to be playing with these like prequel trilogy movies. If you had to change only one thing to make this movie better, in your opinion, what would that one thing be?
It would be to show more of the relationship between Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan and Anakin.
Mm-hmm.
It's like Qui-Gon is set up to be sort of a father figure for Anakin because he's baby Jesus and never had a father.
Right.
Because he was just born from the Force or whatever. And so like showing that like that more father figure thing, they do show that a little bit, but like it could be more.
Mm-hmm.
And then with Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, because I mean Padawan and Jedi Master and like that whole sort of dichotomy and like that sort of understanding is just sort of like not really shown at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have liked to have seen their relationship more, especially because Qui-Gon is such a big player in this movie pretty much alone. He shows up again. He's mentioned again in later movies, but he like his role is pretty much constricted to this movie because he dies. And like seeing more of Obi-Wan and like his banter, maybe like how Obi-Wan has with Anakin later, where it's more brotherly bonded. Like if they had more of like that sort of father-child dynamic too. Yeah. Because Obi-Wan is very much a backseat character. He doesn't do much of anything in this movie.
Right.
Unless Qui-Gon is on screen.
Yeah.
In which case
at the very end, he defeats the Sith and becomes the Master. But yeah, it's very much kind of like a last like sliding into place type of thing. Yeah. My thing, I thought a lot about this because I knew I was going to ask you this question. Like, what would my answer be? I went through a couple of things, but in the end, it's pretty similar. I'd make Obi-Wan Kenobi the main character, and like from the start, and I'd probably, and this is kind of a secondary change, but it's based off the first, is that he's the only one sent to deal with all of this, because I do think it would add a lot of thematic and like in-universe weight to the idea that the Republic is so overconfident in itself and its ability to handle problems that they think sending one Jedi Padawan, not even a master, would be able to take care of this whole thing. And it's,
and then, Qui-Gon gets like involved a little bit later.
Yeah, you could do that, or just have, because I don't think having Qui-Gon as a father figure role for Anakin is particularly like mandatory, because one of the tragedies of Obi-Wan Kenobi's and Anakin Skywalker's relationship, and this is going a little bit ahead, but it's that they kind of start off at odds, but then they kind of learn to live with each other, and they develop a father-son bond pretty much by the end of the second film, definitely, and then by Revenge of the Sith, it's like brothers. They're blood brothers. They've like fought for each other, they've spilled blood for each other, they've sacrificed a lot
for one.
Yeah, so exactly. So I think you don't necessarily need Qui-Gon. In fact, I think it takes away from the Obi-Wan Anakin relationship, because as it is, it works really well, especially by Revenge of the Sith. But if you had even more time to build with that, I think it could have been a lot better, and I think it would have made the film tighter.
When we were watching the movies, I probably would have killed Qui-Gon in like the first act, and the rest of the movie would have been Obi-Wan trying to deal with both the loss of his master and his sort of father figure, because their relationship isn't shown much anyways. Like you could probably sum up the relationship if Qui-Gon was killed around the first half by Darth Maul or by some other
right.
And then like develop. You can even start the beginnings of Obi-Wan's now becoming a new Jedi because he doesn't have a master anymore.
Yeah.
Or if he even is becoming a Jedi at this point, maybe they're just like, oh yeah, we'll find a new master for you because there isn't quite a threat to get them to skip some steps in the Jedi process.
Yeah. That would be interesting.
And then you can also develop their Anakin and Obi-Wan's relationship here, and like in this movie a little bit, and then also have Obi-Wan sort of adjusting to his new position, because we don't really get to see that because he becomes a Jedi Knight at the end of this movie.
Yeah.
And then gets a Padawan almost immediately, and then like he seems although he struggles with Anakin in this next movie, he seems relatively role adjusted to the role.
Yeah.
And it would have been interesting to see that struggle with him a little bit.
Definitely. That's more than one change, but I like you, so I'll let you get away with it. Thank you, lovely internet users, for using time out of your lovely day to listen to the Disney Plus Academy podcast. I know YouTube is not the most conducive format for podcast listening, so I commend you all for making the effort. If it pleaseth thou, please leave a comment, subscribe, and click that notification bell. If you do not want to do any of that, however, do not fear. I will have this podcast on Spotify soon enough. You can get the update on when that happens and more if you follow the podcast's Twitter at DISP Academy Pod. That is at DISP Academy Pod. I thank you all again for listening. I hope to hear from you all again next week, but until then, class is adjourned.